All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this museum conversation, which is related to the Palmer Museum of Art's special exhibition, The Wit and Whimsy of Lucille Corcos. I am Alicia Skeeth, a graduate assistant at the Palmer Museum, and I'm pleased to welcome you here this afternoon for this event. This afternoon, I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout our conversation, so feel free to submit any questions that you might have throughout the talk by using the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom bar. And I will be holding the questions to be answered at the end of our program. The Q&A option is the preferred option for submitting questions, but if you have any difficulties with this, you can also submit your questions in the chat. With that, I would like to now introduce our Curator of American Art, Adam Thomas, who curated the exhibition on Lucille Corcos and who will be speaking to us this afternoon. Adam.
Hi, thanks Alicia, and thanks everybody for joining us here this afternoon. In April, this exhibition was originally slated for last year, and as with so many things was delayed, so we're delighted to be presenting it now this spring through early May. And it's a work, it's an exhibition devoted to the work of this artist and illustrator and designer and muralist, Lucille Corcos, who had a sort of important and flourishing career, particularly in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. And the exhibition sort of surveys those 3 decades through about 25 works in the first floor tempera exhibition gallery at the Palmer. She is, to my mind, an artist who hasn't quite gotten her due, hasn't quite gotten the level of maybe attention in the last couple of decades, at least, that I think she deserves. And the exhibition tries to kind of unpack or tease out or kind of put a finer point on her style, on which I think is kind of characterized by a certain sort of brio and sort of verve. These really sort of vivacious, ebullient, kind of gregarious scenes of that are often sort of densely packed and brightly colored. Like the one you see at the left there. It's also her first solo museum exhibition ever. She has been, deceased for some decades, passed away in 1973. But the last exhibition of her work was put on by Gallery New York in 1997. And since then, actually, in a sort of quiet way, I think her work has sort of gained an appreciation, sort of maybe illustrated by the fact that it's works of hers have sort of steadily entered public collections in this new century. I want to begin with her kind of career trajectory from a moment in the early 1930s, specifically January 1931, when she illustrates this cover for Vanity Fair that I show you there. At the time, only would have been only 22 or 23 years old, and it was an important kind of break for her. And sort of subsequent to this sort of career-changing commission, she becomes really sort of highly sought after and a regular contributor to a variety of publications, some that we know today that continue to be in print, others that are sort of defunct or out of print. Ones like Vanity Fair, of course, but also Fortune and The New Yorker, Vogue, Life Magazine, 17, Red Book, Saturday Evening Post, and sort of fleet of others, particularly those within the kind of Condé Nast family. So she was sort of quite successful in this realm of commercial publishing, but then at the same time always maintained a foothold in the so-called kind of fine art world, exhibiting regularly in group shows from kind of the mid-1930s through the mid-1950s, at least, at a variety of art museums and galleries, but museums including the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and the Art Institute of Chicago, the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, just to name sort of some of the premier ones. And then as I'll sort of return to, I think one of the notable things about her was that thanks to this sort of successful or somewhat sort of illustrious career in the commercial publishing realm as an illustrator, she was the breadwinner in her family, married, raising two sons. And I think that's, significant in the way she was able to kind of balance family and career, but then also, of course, significant for the challenges that she faced in, pre-World War II kind of sexist art world and what have you. She typically worked at a really quite small scale. The paintings in the show, all of them watercolor and gouache or tempera, which isn't necessarily true tempera, but her own kind of experimental concoction that doesn't necessarily age so well sometimes, are around this kind of 18-inch kind of maximum in any direction, sometimes 20 inches. There's one quite large picture, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But she was known for these almost sort of miniaturesque scenes, often sort of jam-packed with figures. And then one of the kind of hallmarks and one of the most significant things about her work, and one of the things I really sort of love and appreciate and have kind of grown to admire more and more, is this kind of cutaway technique, this sort of blurring between different environmental spaces, be they sort of interiors and exteriors or different kind of interior units of particular architectural fabrics, shall we say. New York was the locus of much of her career. New York City, that is. She was born and raised there, born in 1908, educated there, and goes on to study art at the Art Students League in New York in the late 1920s, studying in particular with Jan Moltulka and Richard Leahy, and kind of in these late 20s and early 30s, really part of a kind of coterie of artists, some of whom, or several of whom, really go on to have, let's say, better known careers or kind of make a sort of big splash in kind of mid-century modernist art making. So in particular, I'm thinking of Adolf Gottlieb, the painter. They were close friends with Adolf and Esther Gottlieb, and then also in particular with David Smith, the sculptor, and Dorothy Daner, who also excelled in the medium of sculpture, who were married at the time anyway. Her husband, Edgar Levy, the two becoming kind of acquainted and married, I think, in the late 1920s, 1928, if my information is correct, was also a painter, and we'll sort of maybe delve into some facets where their careers kind of intersect and overlap in a minute. But I want to look at these two scenes first. These are two scenes that are in the show. As I said, kind of both sort of New York centric in a certain way, although of course Vassar outside of the city. And you see the picture on the right, Springtime at Vassar, that's actually featured in the 1940 gallery scene on the left, in the sort of leftmost work on exhibition there. Often Lucille Corcos's work was kind of based around scenes from her actual life. So you might encounter people that she knew, friends and family members, and that is certainly the case here at Grand Central Galleries. The artist depicts herself actually in the lower left, turning there to look as her husband, Edgar Levy, enters the gallery with her close friend, Dorothy Daner, there, the two arriving together in the center of the composition. The woman with a headscarf kind of looking very closely at one of her works was another friend and the art director who would really kind of move her and shake her at Condé Nast from the 30s to the 60s, C.P. Pinellas, and would commission Corcos's work at 17 magazine and Charm magazine and others. Two other figures on the right, Will Burton was a graphic designer, and then his wife, Hilda Burton, the couple there looking at the right wall. So, we get this interest in sort of this fusing of different kinds of architectural spaces, of sort of seeing clear through the gallery walls. That is a kind of repeated and kind of current interest of hers, one of the sort of sophisticated treatments of space that she utilizes throughout her career. And then often seen sort of in that guise as well with the Vassar picture, but with this more sort of aerial vantage point, peeking in through those buildings of what at the time was the sort of all women's college, for a commission from Mademoiselle magazine. Actually, sorry, that was for a later commission, but she undertook a later commission of another college in 1960 for Mademoiselle magazine. But in any case, these sort of fusing of different spaces was one of the kind of well-known kind of hallmarks of her work, even on this small scale. And sometimes that cutaway technique was used with these grand, giant sort of public spectacles, as is the case of two other works from around this moment here. This showing of sometimes the kind of interior or unseen lives of people behind those building spaces from this sort of aerial kind of floating perspective that's not a sort of unified single point perspective. Turning kind of buildings inside out is maybe another way to think about it. And some of what is going on in the Macy's Parade image in particular. And then also, if you look closely, the bird's eye view of this 1939 World's Fair that took place in Queens. And this image was reproduced in Vogue magazine in an issue from 1940. And you get the kind of new sort of modernist sculptures, this new sort of forward-looking architecture, the sphere and so on, amongst those crowds of onlookers, these rows of people, these lines of winding pathways and so on, in these sort of shifts in scale and the kind of illogical flow that lends itself to this sort of overall patterning that really, I think, knows no kind of comparison, although there's other artists, of course, to sort of bring into the discussion. The work at left is in the show. The work of the Macy's Parade is not in the show, but it often, this sort of cutaway technique, we sometimes see it in a kind of more voyeuristic sort of approach, has a kind of more intimate kind of quality, like in Sunday Morning here at the right, where you get the kind of expansive view down the street and then this kind of close up, almost kind of collage-like assemblage of these sort of two-dimensional views through the exterior of the building, sort of glimpses into familial dynamics. And these sort of juxtapositions and kind of fluctuations in scale, earned her kind of various comparisons to Italian primitives of the kind of 14th and 15th century, and other artists. She was also looking to kind of Persian miniaturists, and sometimes that was part of the critical discourse around her work in the 40s and 50s. I just show you two particularly kind of dramatic uses of this cutaway technique that she sort of pioneered and refined, I think, in these two department store scenes, both taken from issues of Fortune magazine, reproduced in articles devoted to these businesses, these department stores, that were kind of really coming into their own in kind of post-war American consumer culture, really. So, we see the kind of revealing of the inner workings of these different businesses, the different floors, the shopper traffic, the sort of subdividing and different areas, this whole kind of network of commerce that the department store allows. But then we also sort of see the way the building itself is situated within the larger city. In Macy's, that being New York, and then in the case of Kaufman's in Pittsburgh. Other artists, she was just among a kind of roster of artists who worked regularly for Fortune magazine. I think she did at least a half a dozen works for Fortune that I know of. Other artists in a more kind of modernist sort of vein that were known to kind of work for Fortune, Charles Sheeler, Ralston Crawford come to mind. But these kind of images by Corcos really sort of call to mind, for me at least, or even sort of anticipate these sort of large format color photographs of the German photographer Andres Gursky that focus on these kind of global systems of the new kind of global economy in our own moment, these sort of images of commerce and stock exchanges in which often, the human actors are sort of rendered insignificant to a larger sort of sense of an overall kind of phenomenon, an overall kind of flow of information or flow of capital, or sort of flow of commerce. Just another Gursky there. The way kind of in Gursky, at least, and I think in Corcos, maybe with a less sort of critical eye to kind of geopolitical critique, the sort of way, people are sort of subsumed within these giant sort of apparatuses and businesses, these kind of compartmentalized mazes, which is maybe a comparison worth thinking about. Another work that Corcos executed for Fortune magazine, this sort of more cartoonish, caricatural image that appeared in September 1943 issue. It came at a very kind of opportune time in which this show was kind of percolating, and it was given as a gift to the Palmer, one of 3 works that are in the Palmer's collection by Corcos that are in the show, of course, too. This work, comes here in the midst of, or she renders it rather in the midst of, World War II, obviously sort of the timing, the backdrop, and it's an image of kind of bureaucratic dysfunction rendered as a football game or football games. There's multiple kind of balls in the air, as it were. Many of these figures are actual figures that were part of FDR Roosevelt's cabinet. part of the US State Department, various kind of secretaries and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries that I won't necessarily go into, but all of those names and figures are kind of acknowledged and itemized in a key that accompanied the article. This article really sort of delving into red tape bureaucracy and kind of unclear leadership that is suggested by all these kind of bodies in the scrum and this disorganization that prevails here. From kind of more public settings to more private ones, I just show you Everybody Meets the Boat, a work from 1937 that she exhibited several times and is reproduced in a couple of publications and kind of well regarded by the sort of critical response in those years. And like much of her work, has a kind of biographical thrust, or sort of relates to some of her own sort of personal goings on. Lucille Corcos and Edgar Levy regularly spent summers in a cottage on Fire Island, and that is sort of the site of this scene here, the island or the boat that goes to the island on the south shore of Long Island. She, in these years, received a commission, sort of based on the strength of some of these works, the illustrative works, and the others received a commission and sort of elevated in reputation, received a commission from the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for a mural project. I believe the initial mural project of the hotel's cafe lounge or lounge cafe took place in 1940. And you see some examples of that illustrated in a contemporary periodical. To the best of my knowledge, the mural is not extant today, but then she went back and had another kind of project for the 6x9 oil on canvas panoramic view of the hotel that's maybe more in keeping with the other kinds of work that I'm showing you, the myriad kind of activities going on within the hotel. This one being maybe perhaps more fanciful, these sort of kind of non-human characters there, and then described thusly in those years in this sort of quote about her personality and this way to sort of infuse or sort of inject a kind of gentle humor or subtle humor in a lot of the things that she was sort of picking up on and seeing and painting in these years. Two other works in the show that I bring together to suggest a way in which I think she plays with temporality that'll become kind of more clear in the next third image, but these two kind of serene interiors with family members. So this is basically her and her husband, Edgar Levy, on the left. And then a sort of similar scene or kind of similar setting of familial life around the piano, her son, David, the eldest son, and his piano teacher there practicing while Edgar reads in the corner. This sort of shift from morning to kind of nighttime, perhaps suggested by that kind of dramatically sloping floor to distinguish kind of one for the other, these sort of subtle variations in environment that she was very much attuned to and very much kind of interested in to mark the passage of time. And this sort of marking of the passage of time in various kind of pictorial forms was something that she returned to again and again. And I think it sort of plays out in this as a kind of pair, but you get it in a better sense of that in a work like The Four Seasons, where all the four seasons, sort of turn into one another. Fall, winter, spring, summer kind of blending into each other. These sort of rural rhythms becoming or sort of growing out of small town commercial center from foreground to background and so on. When this painting was exhibited in 1948 at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, showing these sort of gradual blending, the Philadelphia Inquirer wrote that it was in a class by itself. And in these years, there was also a kind of forerunner to what would be her perhaps kind of most ambitious sort of standalone painting. Certainly, I think her largest that I know of anyway. This painting at left, Children's Games. One of her sort of principal graphic touchstones, and it's often sort of remarked upon by critics and sort of writers in the 40s and 50s when reviewing her work, was the 16th century Flemish artist, the Flemish painter Peter Bruegel. And you can see the way they kind of share in, I think, other works, a sort of affinity for the multitude of figures in this kind of larger sort of unified design, and the sort of highly detailed, sort of very exacting treatment. And this work, Children's Games here from 1951, the most kind of direct and impressive sort of reference to Bruegel, a sort of conscious riff on Bruegel. It's incorporating 100 games throughout these sort of 4 sections that are themselves also, like the 4 seasons images, corresponding to different seasons of the year. So the left corners, the upper and left corners, are spring. The central section then is summer, the lower corner fall, and the upper corner winter, obviously. And then within these sort of sections, playing out the variety of activities that one might encounter in childhood or otherwise. So the adjacent diagram there appeared with the image in an August 1951 issue of Life magazine, and then you see all of the types of play listed in that refer to the key, including the latest edition in 1951 here, the entertainment of the television set, number 56. The painting at left, Everybody's Downtown, was probably inspired by, or maybe kind of actually of, New City, New York, the small hamlet where Lucille Corcos and Edgar Levy moved with their family in 1941, moving out of the city, out of Brooklyn, and upstate about 50 miles or so. And so we see this kind of bustling commercial strip, a kind of image of post-war abundance, the sort of burgeoning hamlets outside New York. This was an image that graced a story in Red Book magazine. And then also I show you a sort of, an image from a sort of similar moment, I think, these kinds of suburban gatherings. And I think, or at least I wonder if there isn't, in that kind of exaggerated quality of those sort of wide, you might say sort of forced smiles, if there's in a kind of critique of, the sort of facade, superficiality of 1950s America, the sort of exaggerated cheerfulness that, we've sort of come to know sort of retrospectively in the era, the sort of extreme politeness or sort of forced sociability that she might be sort of poking fun at, however, sort of subtly. The oyster party and the barn dance, suggestive of the kinds of gatherings that took place at their kind of rural property, Corcos's rural property, the sort of farm and studio that they had in these environs in upstate New York. It also in those years boasted a very active kind of art colony. Henry Varnum Poor, Morris Cantor, composer Kurt Weill, others not only are depicted in this scene that's in the Columbus Museum of Art, but we're sort of locals in this community. So the Corcos Levy family hosted these sort of gatherings, and this is a sort of example of this. Kind of has a kind of folkloric sort of sensibility, nonetheless, and varying degrees of caricature, we might say. But at the same time, a sort of expressive power, I think, that sort of harkens back to the Italian miniaturist, the Italian primitives that she was sort of compared to sometimes. And so I just show you one example that I quite like, or an artist I quite like, Giovanni de Paolo. This sort of hovering, non-rationalistic sort of sense of space that he sort of embraced. The Corcos sort of updates and kind of replicates and owes something to. Other sort of rural or suburban kind of quaint, we might say, scenes. These two works are also in the show. The kind of winding outskirts of the towns that they were living in at the time. The image on the left, you see, had kind of wide currency as a newspaper sort of insert, this sort of Sunday circular. I've seen it in Philadelphia publications, but this is an example from the Boston Advertiser there in December of the same year that she executed it. Kind of similar sorts of sensibilities in a certain way, these sort of large gatherings of families and children and sort of playfulness. I think that's likely her depicting herself at the center of the school picnic, or at least the seated woman in the red skirt resembles Corcos. And then also, the school meeting, a sort of wonderful example, I think, of this use of the sort of disappearing architecture technique that she gabbled with and sort of experimented in various sorts of forms, where you get the sort of suggestion of a kind of exterior wall, or sort of peering through that wall into the goings on of this school council or meeting or what have you. I bring in this work by a contemporary, a much kind of better known today, at least, contemporary of Corcos's. Not so much to suggest their formal affinities, although those are probably obvious, I hope, to you, that they share certain kind of hallmarks, a certain kind of naive or kind of folk, so-called kind of folk style, but rather actually to maybe suggest the way in which those kind of comparisons never really fit Corcos in her day, at least. So, other comparisons might include Grant Wood or sort of Horace Pippin or Thomas Hart Benton. But her style never really fully aligned with the sensibilities of kind of American regionalist artists like Benton or Wood, for example, and with these sort of so-called kind of modernist, folk artists like Grandma Moses and Horace Pippin and others. Grandma Moses, had sort of rising to recognition in the late 1930s, had some works included at the Museum of Modern Art, I think in 1939. But, that she wasn't, there's a sort of kind of uncomfortableness, I think, about sort of slotting her in, or she never really was able to be kind of categorized with any sort of neat demarcating kind of articulation. And maybe that's one of the things that's interesting about her. And then I show you another comparison to close friend, Dorothy Daner, who embraced this sort of semi-naïve kind of handling of space and anatomy in these years as well. this is a painting that's also in the show by Daner from 1942, an artist who would go on, to really pursue abstraction with force and sort of gusto, and have a kind of renowned career as a sculptor. But here in the early 1940s, showing this kind of raucous communal gathering near Bolton Landing, where her and David Smith, settled, and obviously having some kind of formal similarities to Corcos, her close kind of friend and confidant in these years. The collaborations between the two had begun. Between those two and others here, have begun in 1933. This sort of playful collaborative etching involving these three couples, these 6 artists that you see listed there, the 6 that I've kind of been mentioning here off and on, that were close friends at the time, and at the Art Students League together. The portraits, they sort of executed this etching on a whim, probably drinking and kind of carousing in their Brooklyn apartments, and the version that's in the show is the only proof that was pulled from the etching plate in 1933. The artist's son, Lucille Corcos' son, in the 70s went back and printed an edition of 100 from the original etching plate, but was kind enough to loan the only version that's known to have been pulled from that etching plate. So you see Lucille in the top left by Dorothy Daner, David Smith, then moving from left to right, David Smith by Lucille Corcos, signed there, Hey Papa David by Lucille, and then Adolf Gottlieb by Edgar Levy, and then in the bottom row, Edgar Levy by Esther Gottlieb. At center, bottom, Dorothy Daner by Adolf Gottlieb, and then finally in the lower right, Esther Gottlieb, pictured by David Smith. So, Corcos was sort of integral to this group, to this sort of wider network of modernist painters and sculptors. And she was also something of a muse for these artists as well. I just want to turn to a couple works that aren't in the show, but I think that kind of illustrate this point. Before that, this is a photograph of this group of this group of friends that I'm talking about here. The woman at the left is Dorothy Daner's aunt, and the photograph was taken by Edgar Levy before they sailing or taking a ship to Europe. So 2 works, this painting in the National Gallery by Adolf Gottlieb of Lucille, and then David Smith's roughly contemporaneous sculpture of Lucille as well, sort of suggesting of her as a bit of a kind of muse, a figure that was amongst these artists and coming into kind of her own career in her own right in these years. Edgar Levy, her husband, of course, also painted her numerous times. Levy, kind of well steeped in Picasso in particular. The work at the right of Lucille at her drafting board, this kind of very focused, yet simplified visage, indicative of a kind of determination on her part, but owing something to the kind of works that Picasso was making in these years in the 1930s. The motif of the face that kind of encompasses both frontal and profile views, that kind of emphatic black outlines of the figure, and then of course this very simplified approach to bodily form, as well as the bright colors, were kind of indicative of Levy's style, at least in these years. In Levy was championed by his teacher Jan Maltuika, but then also the artist John Graham in the 1930s. But it's my understanding that he sort of had, we might say, kind of no appetite for commerce, for the sort of business of exhibiting and promotion that kind of comes along, I suppose, with being an artist, or maybe does sometimes at least. So the fact that his wife Lucille was quite successful financially, her support basically made it so that he was able to commit himself to painting full time, and in a sense sort of withdrawing from that business of exhibiting in the sort of New York scene. Although the two artists Lucille and Edgar had a joint exhibition in 1954 that was kind of billed as commemorating the wedding anniversary and 25 years of painting under the same roof. Another portrait, self-portrait in this case, that's in this show by Lucille Corcos is the smaller scale work that's at left. And I think it makes a kind of hopefully interesting closing comparison to think about their kind of self-presentation or presentation of someone else, and the way she depicts herself there. I take it that it's Edgar is in the background there at work in that shared studio space in that kind of crowded room. And then lastly, a painting called The Art Class is another kind of quasi self-portrait in that we see these kind of 13 images of Corcos's self going about kind of routine chores, but also art making sort of stations, sort of shuttling between them, representing herself as part of this kind of continuous narrative, these different scenes and the kind of tireless pursuit of her art, really, but then also in the kind of business of keeping a home running, juggling, we might say, kind of work and household, at least cooking and baking there. So she's sort of wearing different kinds of aprons as she goes about doing different tasks, and then in different rooms that are sort of rendered in her own kind of spatial logic together, cut away, sort of blurred, merging together. This kind of multiplication of the self, I think, maybe speaking to the sort of accelerations of the speed or sort of pace of life of the world in kind of post-war America in the 1950s, the kind of frenetic energy maybe required. And of course, it's notable, I think, that she's doing this, or representing herself doing this at least, without any assistance from Edgar Levy. Her son is there at the center of this universe, but somehow everything isn't really about him. It's this kind of send up on the nature of kind of home and career, the sort of struggle, I think, to sort of juggle those various kind of roles in life. And suggestive of that kind of broader struggle that was going on, in the 1950s for many women. The struggle to sort of be a mother and perhaps have a career, and manage a variety of expectations and sort of shifting gender roles. These are the kinds of questions that are explicitly asked in a book that Corcos illustrated in just a couple years prior. A book called Women Today, The Conflicts, the Frustrations, and Their Fulfillments. She illustrated about a dozen different scenes, and I just show you two in that, these sort of very fine kind of line drawings. And of course, I think the image and the work for this book sort of call attention to her unusual position as the chief kind of financial support for her family in these decades, as kind of an anomaly, and as she resisted traditional gender roles. So the painting too kind of somehow taps into this changing framework. Let's stop there and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions from David Werner. So his first question is, do you know where the Waldorf Astoria mural might have ended up?
I don't know what the fate of the murals were. It was difficult to even find any kind of images of them. There's various indications in the press in the 40s that she's sort of doing these murals, but I haven't even come across good images, photographs, or what have you, from them subsequent to the execution. And then it does seem, as best I can tell, those works may have been destroyed or covered over. I don't know what precisely became of them. If anybody does, I would be happy to learn more. It was a question, it was one of the questions that I couldn't answer for this show. And Lucille Corcos, that's the mural project I know sort of most about, and obviously I know very little about it. However, she was involved with another mural project late in her life that didn't come to fruition in the 1970s, I believe, as well.
Okay, and then we had a similar question also from David about the location of the Kaufman department store and Macy's department store works and where they ended up.
Yeah, neither of those I've come across and haven't seen them in any records. The images that I showed you were from the periodicals themselves. So sort of tracking them back to their illustrations in Fortune magazine. Those images are not in the show, but I think, as I said, are these very sort of special use of the cutaway, and were likely commissioned, is my understanding, for the department store themselves. There's, in the Kaufman's article, there's some other works that illustrate this sort of 6-page spread that she does. So there was a sort of whole suite of images that she produced for that. I don't know about the Macy's one as much.
Then we had a comment from an anonymous attendee. Her portrait of her and her husband painting is so interestingly compared to his portrait of her at work, almost telling. Without knowing of their relationship, her portrait of him is almost juvenile.
Yeah, so I think what you're kind of entirely pointing to is the depiction of the male figure at the back of the room there. And it has been proposed to me that it might be her son, but actually I am not quite sure about that, because there's a way in which actually in some of the works that Edgar Levy was sort of beginning to paint, he shows himself in this kind of miniaturist style, actually, that's sort of maybe closer to Corcos's sort of paint handling than this kind of Picassoid style that you see at right. So it's a bit of a mystery exactly sort of who that figure is. I think there's the way the figure kind of is smaller than the easel sort of suggests that. But nonetheless, there's a whole kind of array of artistic materials that to me maybe suggests that it is Edgar.
Our next question is from Jason. So in your opinion, Adam, what museums have the best collections of her work?
Well, I don't know if I can speak to the best. There's a work that was acquired, a small work that was acquired by the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, I think 2 years ago. Bates College has some drawings by her. There's kind of half a dozen or so museums that seem to have acquired her work in about the last 2 decades. So I can sort of, direct you more specifically if those are of interest. Some of the work was generously loaned to this show, including from the Loeb at Vassar College and the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Ohio. But much of the work is in private hands, and sort of seems to remain so, although there is a lot of kind of interest that sort of bubbles up from certain quarters anyway.
And then we had another comment from David making a comment that the Basset hounds in the last picture, the art class, were purchased at Tate Farms in State College.
Yeah, my understanding is that the Corcos Levy family had a long love of the Basset hound, and sometimes those Basset hounds make appearances in both Edgar and Lucille's art, and they do have a connection to, I think, to the local breeder. I don't know if that's the right word, but the local Tate Farm that specializes in Basset hounds. Yes.
So I actually had a question. So I was wondering if Lucille Corcos kind of did any illustrations for children's books, and if there's any relationship between like her handling and kind of contemporaneous illustrations in like children's books during that time.
Yes. So in addition to illustrating for the periodical press, particularly kind of the numerous magazines under the aegis of Condé Nast, she did illustrate a number of books. I'm thinking of probably at least a half dozen, maybe 8 or so editions of Grimm's Fairy Tales, I think in 1962. The Lame Little Prince from 1948, thereabouts. And then there's 2 that are in the show, actually. An edition, a 1957 edition of Oscar Wilde's 1891 story, The Picture of Dorian Gray, that's on loan from the Special Collections Library at Penn State. And then also a volume of sheet music from Gilbert and Sullivan. It was a 1941 book of music, and she also illustrated a 1960 volume of sheet music that was more varied. But in addition to kind of illustrating some of these editions of other people's or other authors' work, she authored at least 2 of her own books. Both, I suppose, would be categorized as children's books. One called Joel Gets a Haircut. She had 2 sons, David and Joel. So the latter book being kind of about sort of based on a kind of incident in the life of Joel from 1952, and then another much later, 2 decades later, in 1972, called The City Book, which is scenes of New York, but is sort of aimed at a younger audience. So, the show, I think the latest work that's featured in the show is from the late 1950s. I haven't come across a lot of her work from the 60s. She seems to turn more to illustrating books in kind of the 50s and 60s and later in life, and away from exhibiting to the kind of exhibition records of her work seem to generally kind of terminate in the 50s.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, but if anyone has any remaining questions, you could put in there quick. But I just wanted to let everyone know, just a reminder that the exhibition is on view at the museum. And so I would encourage everyone to go and see it in person. If you're able to, just make sure that you visit the Palmer Museum's website to reserve your time ticket, and the exhibition will be open until May 9th. And like Adam said, it's on view on the first floor. But thank you, Adam, for presenting us with this great information, a greater in-depth look at Lucille Corcos's work.
Thank you.